On this episode, Dr. Clifford Penner and his wife Joyce Penner join us to talk about their book, Getting Your Sex Life Off to a Great Start. That's up next on this episode of the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast.
Welcome to the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast, where families are equipped to reflect God's redeeming love. And now, here are your hosts, Michael Campagna and Jared Lambert.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast. I'm your co-host, Michael Campagna. Joining me is Jared Lambert, as always. How's it going, Jared?
Doing great. Thank you, Michael. Well, we want to start off the podcast by letting our audience know that today we will be discussing a topic that may not be appropriate for younger children. So we just ask the audience to use caution and wisdom while listening to this episode of the podcast. Also, we need to apologize in advance. We did have some technical difficulties while recording our special guests from California, and those difficulties did affect the audio quality. And on top of that, we had some sirens and some horns in the background of our special guest. So don't be alarmed by those brief interruptions. And again, we apologize in advance for those issues. But despite those minor setbacks, it's going to be a great podcast, and we're excited to have our guests join us.
Absolutely. Today, we're talking about sex. We're talking about intimacy, talking about the relationship between men and women, and we are very excited to have some special guests with us. Jared, can you introduce our guests and tell our audience a little bit about them?
Yeah, as I'm sowing into my own marriage, as I'm ministering to other couples here at Healing Place Church, I began to see the value of intimacy. Got referred to a great book by Dr. Clifford and Dr. Joyce Penner, a husband and wife team, PhDs, great background, great wisdom, and the book just really blessed my life. So the book is called The Gift of Sex. Today, however, we're going to be talking about getting your sex life off to a great start. So they're doctors, they're authors, they're brothers and sisters in the kingdom of God. So I think this is going to be a great resource for couples who want to enrich their intimacy, but especially for couples who are engaged, dating, and preparing to get married. We're going to help them get their sex life off to a great start.
Great deal. Well, doctors, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. We're glad to be here.
Yeah, it's always a good experience to be able to talk about these issues out there in the world.
A lot of couples, I know, struggle in the area of intimacy. How important, in your opinion, is it that these issues be addressed even before they begin, before marriage?
So helpful when couples actually deal with and prepare for their sex life in marriage beforehand, rather than just wait and let's see what happens, and then sometimes it goes great, but many times there are issues that arise that could have been prevented if they had educated, talked, learned about themselves and each other.
What we often hear from engaged couples is, we don't want to do anything ahead of time, even learn about it, that will destroy the mystery, because somehow if we learn about it, then it's not going to be natural. We want to just do what comes natural. Well, we've had so many inputs in the world that make it unnatural that the only thing that really works is if people prepare themselves really well ahead of time so that they go into their sexual experience with knowledge and information rather than going blind.
And particularly if they talk to each other and clarify what they picture it will be like and what their expectations are. What we see most in our office are newly married couples who each had a vision of what it would be, what their sexual life would be like. And then that isn't, one of them, they saw it so differently that they got into tension right away on the honeymoon.
Yeah, you mentioned something that I'd like to talk more about. Like you saying, talk about it, getting themselves educated before getting married. Talk more about some of the fears that you talked about, because I know, like, for speaking from a man's point of view, even the discussion of these things could stir up some stir up the flesh. And so, what kind of precautions would you recommend when engaged couples are trying to educate themselves on intimacy?
Well, first of all, if there's concern about that, we always say, well, why don't you read this book together in your parents' living room while they're in the kitchen? And
or out, we've got a.
That is a great practical application.
Yes.
For diffusing.
Or go to a park where there are people all around, and you're just going to read the book together, but you don't have to worry about being, quote, tempted.
Yeah.
In other words, control the external situation.
There you go.
So that because so many times we find couples want to save sex for marriage, but then they put themselves into compromising situations where it's difficult to keep with their decision.
You know, they might sleep in the bed together, or they might travel together, or do all those kind of things. Well, obviously, those are natural settings where their bodies would want to take them further. So our suggestion always is, if you've really decided that you're not going to get together sexually before you get married, then don't put yourself in circumstances where that's likely to happen and is easily drawn into.
Right. That's great.
That's good wisdom. So let's talk about some practical things here. How can a couple successfully transition themselves from going from pre-marriage to saving themselves into a healthy sexual relationship as a married couple?
Yes, and that's what we try to help. So many of us, most of us, we hope, have all that desire and passion ahead of time. And that passion is wonderful, and we want to affirm that in couples. In fact, we tell couples, if it isn't hard for you to keep with your commitment of not having sex before marriage, then you better get help, because it should be difficult. We're designed to want it. Our bodies are made that way. And when we don't have those desires, then something may have happened in our past that blocks those, because the way God designed us, our sexual drives are meant to be strong.
So that brings us to the subject of being very aware of what we're bringing into the marriage from our background. For example, if we grew up in a home where our sexuality was affirmed as a gift from God, and we saw our parents being warm and enjoying each other, not that we saw them having sex, but that we sensed that they were loving and caring, and we got a positive message about our sexuality, then that's likely what we'll bring into the marriage.
However, if we were raised in a home where that wasn't the case, and we had a model that isn't the model we would like to have in our marriage, then we have to be much more intentional about being different and choosing a different way of relating.
So one thing is what we saw in our home. A second thing is if there was any kind of violation or abuse that occurred either physically or verbally, something that we witnessed that has tarnished our view of sex, that is going to get in the way.
I just was speaking with someone this morning who called to get help, and she had been raised in a home where sex was really shamed, and yet she had some bad experiences growing up, and yet she thought, once she gets married, we're both believers, we're both followers of Jesus, everything will be okay. And it wasn't, and it still isn't. And we're designed for it to be okay, but sin is in the world, and people around us make mistakes, and we get hurt, and so those have to be worked through in order to transfer our premarital passion into marriage.
So what we brought from our home, if there was violation of us as we were growing up, if we've had some damaging relationships prior to the relationship that's moving into marriage, that's another thing that has to be faced and dealt with. And then if anyone is struggling with any kind of a sexual addiction, for example, if somebody's hooked on porn and they're thinking, I get married,
then I can have the real thing, then I won't be tempted anymore.
Not true. the temptation continues even after marriage, even if there's an ongoing sex life. So all that stuff has to get dealt with as we prepare for a wonderful sex life in our marriage.
And then I think another thing is, even if we didn't have anything negative or damaging, just that we've connected our spirituality with our sexuality.
Right.
When we have separated those two, and somehow we've thought that sex is kind of risky and wrong, and we only enjoy it when it's bad or tempting or whatever, and it's not part of how we don't bring God into that. That can cause issues. So we want to make sure we recognize that we really believe that sex is good and of God, and that God wants us to have a wonderful sex life in our marriages. And that's what he wants for us. So that's an important quality to make sure that's integrated. And then that we just understand how men and women are different. We understand how our bodies are designed to work. We understand what the sexual process of coming together to become one is like. Having that knowledge, having information, talking about it together, clarifying our picture of what we expect can make such a difference for couples going into marriage.
Right. One of the best revelations that came to me was the fact that God was the designer and the creator of sexual intimacy, and it was good. So that's encouraging to hear.
Yeah, we always think of that passage in the second chapter of Genesis, verse 24, where the whole subject of sex is introduced before there's any talk of sin, when it says, therefore a man leaves his father and mother, clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. And when it's talking about one flesh, it's talking about the union of the husband and wife sexually. And this is, in our view, God's early blessing of our sexual desire and sexual union.
Right.
Sure, and that runs somewhat counter to the way that Christians typically raise their young people.
Yes, we're always taught, don't do it, without the counter message that says, what we like to say is, the choices we make before marriage will impact our sexual relationship in marriage. And God wants us to have a wonderful, fulfilling, mutually enjoyable, delightful sexual relationship in our marriages.
And so what we want to do is communicate the idea is that sex is a wonderful gift from God that you need to treat very preciously. It is not just the keep thyself pure message, which is an important message, but we also want to give the opposite side of that. You're keeping yourself pure so that you can thoroughly and totally enjoy it when you are in a God-blessed union.
We sometimes use the analogy of a very fine piece of jewelry. If we've been given a delightful gift and expensive, precious pearls, we wouldn't just give them to our adolescent to throw in their backpack and take to school. We would save those in a special cabinet and wear them for special occasions. And it's a special gift. It's not that it's bad. It's not that it's dirty. It's not that it's wrong. It's only that it's to be contained within the context, enjoyed within the context.
Well, in fact, Paul talks about this in the first Corinthians chapter 7 when the Corinthians church asked him, is it a good thing to have sexual relations? And his answer was, of course.
Certainly.
Right.
A man is to have a wife and a woman's to have a husband, and that our sexual drives are strong, but marriage is strong enough to contain them and provide for a balanced and fulfilling sexual life in a world of sexual disorder.
Right. You know, you mentioned about how important it is to know how our bodies work and to accept and make the male-female differences work for them. If we can take just a couple minutes and talk a little bit practically, maybe highlight a little of what your book, Getting Your Sex Off to a Great Start. next couple of minutes, let's take a couple of minutes and talk about some of the differences and how the listeners who are preparing for marriage can make those differences work for them.
Yes, just a very simple one. If men's bodies are designed so that when they get aroused, it's kind of, when we picture it, it's like a straight line up, straight. They have release and then down. Whereas a woman's is much more like she rides the waves. And when the scripture in Ephesians talks about the husband is to love his wife like Christ loves the church, and then Paul quotes that verse from Genesis 2. So he's talking about the sexual relationship specifically, that's where the husband is to love his wife like Christ loves the church. And how does Christ love the church? He gives up his rights and gets with us where we are. And when the husband is able to learn to ride the waves with his wife, both of them end up having a much more delightful experience. It's very difficult for her to be able to learn to respond the way his body does, but he can easily delay that immediate gratification and learn to enjoy the ride and rather than go for the goal.
And one of the reasons for that is why that is so important is that a man operates on really one track. When his body is ready, when he's aroused, he's usually ready to proceed.
Emotionally and as well, and relationally.
And whereas for a woman, she may be physically aroused, but not ready at all to proceed into the total sexual experience. In fact, the research has shown that many women don't even recognize that their body is aroused
when it is.
When it is aroused. And
Right.
so the woman really operates on two tracks, her bodily track and the emotional track.
And that's why so often it talks about the woman's needs are more emotional and the man's need is more physical. But we wouldn't say it quite that way. We would say the emotional for the woman has to be connected with her physical. So even though her body's working, if she isn't in touch with that, or she isn't feeling safe, or she's feeling hurt, like it's hard for women to understand how they could have a fight and then he could be ready to have sex. And for most women, that isn't the case. They need to feel the healing and the connection before they can be ready. And it isn't just that her need is emotional, his is physical. It's that the two have to be together.
Yeah, so to put it another way, when a man is aroused, there's a short time period of arousal before climax. And then
if
when
he
a
just
woman's
goes with his natural inclination,
Right.
yes.
So what we're trying to encourage is if a man selfishly follows his body's desires, he could reach climax far too early, and like you said, leaving his wife unsatisfied.
Right, and then she eventually gets frustrated, and then he's unhappy also.
Right.
So long term, they're going to both be a lot happier. He's going to be a lot happier, and we think of that, Philippians 2, where it talks about Christ giving up his rights and privileges and becoming like us, even, to death on the cross. And then God exalted him. And it's interesting that when the man is willing to give up his natural tendency, it is then that he actually has more joy and delight, because the thing that makes a man happiest is when his wife is turned on and enjoying sex.
Right.
And if she's not enjoying it, he's not going to be as happy. But if he's just going after his own selfish way, she won't be enjoying it.
And then he will get his physical release, but he will not have the relational, emotional fulfillment and connection that's essential for all of us.
Now, we have to give a little disclaimer on that. For the newly married couple, this takes a while to learn.
Good,
So
yeah.
we don't, on the first night, if the man moves quickly from arousal to release, we just recommend just keep playing. Don't stop there, because he's got to learn that. That isn't going to just happen easily, especially if it's their first time and all of that. But this is a process to be learned, not to make himself feel badly.
The first time we get out on a tennis court, we don't have a perfect serve. You know?
So,
Right.
so it's the long time goal and the attitude and the feeling that he's connected with her, even if his body isn't participating completely
Because
initially.
a lot of men will, on those early experiences, especially if they haven't had sexual experiences before, ejaculate prematurely. That is
Right.
just what happens. And if they can be understanding about that, fortunately, they've got a whole life ahead of them to learn how to
Right.
get better at
And
that.
another thing we would say is many times women, if they have never had an orgasm or release through self-stimulation or just in their sleep or any other way, that takes a while for their body to learn also. And so many times we have couples come to us that are so in such despair. In fact, we have couples call us on their honeymoon. We'll say a minute about that, something about that after I finish this. But a woman shouldn't expect that will just happen naturally. She has to train her body to be able to respond. So we encourage couples when they're new just to focus on the joy and the delight in getting to know each other and their bodies. If they have good information and they can read the Getting Your Sex Life Off to a Great Start, if they can read Getting Your Sex Life Off to a Great Start out loud together and talk about it and have clear expectations, then they won't have the frustration and disappointment.
Yeah, we recommend that a couple start reading Getting Your Sex Life Off to a Great Start about 6 months before their wedding date,
Right.
and kind of work through it. And then in the honeymoon chapter, we actually have our phone number right in the middle of the chapter for our offices. And we say, if you run into trouble on your honeymoon, we don't care where you are, call us. And we regularly get calls from all over the world.
Right.
And that is, I usually take those calls, and it's very rewarding. Sometimes it's 5-10 minutes, and it's going to make such a difference for the couple in terms of their memory of their honeymoon. Every anniversary, we think about our honeymoon. And if I can give them a little bit of guidance, that's going to change it from a feeling of discouragement and despair to something anticipatory and helpful and hopeful that will make a difference for the rest of their marriage.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I'm thinking, as you're saying it, I'm thinking, how important is it to have, that discipleship and shepherding, to have somebody in your local church, whether pastor, staff, or volunteer leader, or just somebody love, and's been doing life with, to walk with you through this marriage preparation, especially in terms of sexual intimacy, to somebody to have to bounce those questions off of, to get a good, to get wisdom on
Yes.
the area of intimacy. So we appreciate your phone number, but hopefully our listeners have some people in their lives that are doing life with them and discipling them, even through
Yes.
the learning about intimacy coming up
Yeah,
through the marriage.
we hope those disciples use our book so that they don't give them wrong advice, because
There you
sometimes the calls are because they did have somebody, but not what they should have heard.
Right.
So,
One of the things, too, that we strongly encourage, and this is shifting subjects a little bit, but we strongly encourage that couples design their honeymoon together so that they match in terms of what their desires and expectations are. Because sometimes the man is thinking, we're gonna go on a honeymoon and we're just going to stay in the room and going to have sex 5 times a day, and
or sometimes she thinks that.
yeah, and then the other one thinks, yeah, we'll have some sex, but we're going to go to the beach, or we're going to go to the mountains, or whatever, and
Sightseeing.
and we just have heard. Partly we're biased, but we've heard so many.
We hear the ones that don't work out, so we
We've heard so many negative honeymoon stories, and usually it's because they weren't coordinated with each other in terms of their expectations.
Well, so what practically, besides simply clarifying expectations and obviously reading your book, is there any other practical things that a couple can do to make sure that they have a honeymoon that establishes a good pattern for the rest of their lives?
Yes. And the first thing is to get themselves educated, as we've already mentioned. Then to make sure they do talk together and plan together. So they envision, they create a picture of what they think it's going to be, and test that out with the book or with someone that's reasonable as their expectation within the realm. Temper that expectation so that it doesn't set them up to feel like failures, but rather this is a delightful time of discovery.
But then they also need to be doing some physical preparation.
Yes.
Need to be able to have gone to the doctor, and particularly for the woman, and have been checked out.
And the most common issue that we get calls about on the honeymoon, and that's where for those who are listening, who are the disciples, we would really highly recommend that if you're working with a couple that's planning to get married, or if you're a couple that's planning to get married, make sure that the woman is able to have entry into the vagina, because the most common one is that it doesn't work, and they actually are not able to. And there's a condition called vaginismus, which keeps that from being able to happen, and it can be corrected. It's very correctable.
And it can even be corrected before they get married, before they even attempt any intercourse. There are treatments for that. And so that's why it's so absolutely important for the woman especially to have a full physical exam that determines whether intercourse is really even going to be possible for them.
But we have just recently had a woman call who got home from her honeymoon and went to see a doctor, and the doctor said, just have a glass of wine. And they weren't people who drank, but they decided, okay, that didn't work. So she went to another doctor and said, they'd had the glass of wine, and that doctor said, well, then just have 2 glasses of wine. And then she realized, I don't think this is doing it. So she Googled unable to have intercourse and got to our website, and that's how she called us, and we got her the help she needed. Wow. But sometimes the wrong advice is given, or just keep trying, or you'll be able to do it. And there is a physical condition that needs to be treated, and we won't get into that kind of detail, but it is correctable and should be addressed ahead of time. So she should get an exam to find out whether it will be possible.
Yeah, overall, it's really good advice for the husbands to just be gentle.
Yes.
Despite that we're stirred up, despite that, our heart's racing, the adrenaline, the testosterone's pumping. If you could just take a breath, slow down, and be gentle, that would really help things.
And the slowing down, if there's one bit of advice that virtually every couple response when we talk about this, like at seminars, and we'll bring up the subject of slowing down, virtually 100% of the women are nodding their heads in affirmation of that. Mm-hmm. That's true when a couple gets started, but that's often a pattern then that continues on into the marriage.
A long time. And rather than racing to the goal, and everything else in life, the sooner we reach our goal, the more successful we're seen, and especially for men. So here, all of a sudden, we've got to totally change our mentality that this isn't about reaching a goal. This is about taking your time and enjoying the ride, enjoying the journey.
We often talk about instead of gobbling the ice cream cone, you just want to take it one little lick at a time, because then it lasts a lot longer and you extend the pleasure. Well, that's a little bit how we want to think about our sexual experiences, particularly when we're getting started.
Sure, and if as the men, we make our goal pleasing our spouse, then it changes our perspective quite a bit.
Right, and another way to talk about that is the best way the man pleases is by helping her listen to her body and going with her as she leads with her body, not by control, not by demand, but just getting with her and reading her and listening to her. That's what's most helpful.
Now, sometimes men feel like they're supposed to arrive at the sexual bed as the sexual expert, but
that can put pressure on him.
Yeah, and there's nothing innate about being a man that makes us a sexual expert unless we have sexual experience.
Or knowledge or training or something.
Right.
And so we always want to get the pressure off the man that he's supposed to know what he's doing if he's never done it before, just like the woman doesn't know what she's doing if she's never done it before, and that you're going into this learning together and making it a delightfully pleasurable event rather than one that puts pressure on them to somehow measure up to some kind of imagined standard.
And this is how we believe God prepared us for this work, because when we got married in 1963, a long time ago,
100 years ago.
I just graduated from a school of nursing program where we were in a Baptist school of nursing where they hired a female clinical psychologist to teach us a prep to marriage class and gave us just wonderful information that I shared with Cliff, and we were so happy. We were naive and both came inexperienced and just delighted in getting to know each other rather than having high expectations, mainly because of that class.
Yeah, we were both raised in Mennonite homes, and so there wasn't any talk about the subject of sex there. So
It all
we had
came
to
from that class.
pick it up from that class that Joyce got.
Excellent. Well, all right. The book is called Getting Your Sex Life Off to a Great Start. Its authors are our guests, Doctors Clifford and Joyce Penner. Real quick, want to give y'all, our listeners, their website where you can get more of their resources and get some contact information. It is www.passionatecommitment.com. Again, www.passionatecommitment.com.
Just to correct that, there's no dot between passionate and commitment. It's just passionatecommitment.com.
That's right.
Okay.
All right. Well, we sure appreciate having you on this week. I think this is going to be a huge blessing for those preparing for marriage, or if you're an adult couple who has young people in the house, maybe pass this on to them, help them get their minds in the right place before they go off on their honeymoon.
Well, in fact, we would say that this is a very affirming message if the parents give the newly engaged couple this book. That just
That
in that
already
gift sends a blessing.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Okay, folks. Well, make sure you like, comment, subscribe to the podcast. That really helps get the word out to as many people as possible. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us for today's podcast. For more information about Healing Place Church, visit us at healingplacechurch.org. For more podcast episodes, subscribe to the Healing Place Marriage and Family Podcast on iTunes or the podcast server for your device.